Welcome back, everyone, to another deep dive. Today, we're going to be tackling two institutions that are absolutely essential for anyone interested in international relations,
Yeah,
and especially for those of you prepping for the UPSC exam,
absolutely.
the World Bank and the
Right.
WTO.
Yeah. These organizations are really key players on the global economic stage.
Yeah, for sure.
The World Bank focuses on providing loans and assistance to developing countries,
Right,
while the WTO sets the rules for global trade.
exactly. They're mentioned constantly in the news, but let's be honest. They can seem a bit like mysterious giants from the outside.
Definitely.
So what we're doing today is unpacking what they really do, how they've evolved, and whether they truly live up to their goals.
Right.
We'll be diving into some really interesting sources that cover their history, their impact, and some of the controversies that surround them.
Yeah, it's a fascinating journey. To understand these institutions, we need to go back to their origins in the aftermath of World War II. The World Bank, along with the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, was created with the initial goal of rebuilding war-torn Europe.
That makes sense. But I read that their focus shifted dramatically in the 1960s, right?
Precisely. The spotlight turned to the developing world, and the World Bank's mission expanded to address the challenges of poverty and underdevelopment.
And this is where things get really interesting. One of our sources mentions Robert McNamara,
Oh, yeah.
the former U.S. Defense Secretary, becoming the World Bank's president in 1968.
Wow.
Quite the career shift. What impact did he have?
Well, McNamara brought a whole new perspective to the World Bank. He pushed for a broader approach, going beyond just building infrastructure
Yeah.
to tackle issues like population control, education, and even human rights
Wow.
as crucial elements of development.
So a more holistic view, not just focusing on economic growth in isolation.
Yeah, he recognized the interconnectedness of social and economic factors in development. But then, under leaders like Clausen and Kruger in the 1980s, the pendulum swung back towards market-oriented policies. This is where the Washington Consensus comes in,
Right.
advocating for free markets, privatization, and deregulation as the path to prosperity.
And I'm guessing this is where the infamous structural adjustment policies come into play.
Exactly.
Our sources mention those quite a bit.
Yeah, these policies were often attached to World Bank loans and required countries to implement significant economic reforms. While intended to promote growth and efficiency, they were criticized for often leading to increased poverty and inequality.
That's a pretty serious accusation. What were the specific concerns with these policies?
Well, forcing governments to cut spending on social programs, for example, can have devastating effects on the most vulnerable populations.
Right.
And encouraging developing countries to focus on exporting cash crops like coffee or cocoa often created a dangerous dependency on volatile global markets.
So instead of breaking free from poverty, they became even more susceptible to fluctuations in global commodity prices.
Exactly. This brings us to the issue of trade imbalances, where developed countries typically sell high-value manufactured goods, while developing countries are often stuck exporting low-value raw materials. This can perpetuate a cycle of economic disadvantage.
So has the World Bank learned from these criticisms? Have they shifted their approach in recent years?
There's definitely been a noticeable change since the 1990s. The World Bank now emphasizes sustainable development, good governance, and anti-corruption measures. They've recognized that good governance is vital for creating an environment where development can flourish.
Good governance is interesting. Doesn't that seem to contradict the minimal government idea of the Washington Consensus?
You've hit on a key point. It signals a recognition that the state plays an essential role in providing social safety nets and regulating markets to ensure fairness and stability. Think about the 2008 financial crisis.
Right.
It highlighted the dangers of unfettered markets and the need for prudent government oversight. This shift also reflects a growing awareness that development is not a one-size-fits-all formula.
Right.
It requires a tailored approach that considers each country's unique context.
It sounds like they're trying to find a more balanced approach, recognizing that markets need some level of regulation and that the state has a crucial role to play in development. What about this concept of partnership that keeps popping up in our sources?
That's another significant shift. The World Bank is increasingly emphasizing local control and ownership of development projects involving communities and governments in the design and implementation phases.
Okay.
For example, in 2010, they implemented a significant capital increase that boosted the voting power of developing countries to 47%, with the goal of reaching 50% over time.
That's a big step towards giving developing countries a stronger voice within the World Bank, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It signifies a move towards greater inclusivity and a recognition that development is most effective when it's driven by the people it aims to benefit. Now, while the World Bank focuses on development finance, there's another institution that plays a crucial role in shaping the global economic landscape,
Right.
the World Trade Organization, or WTO.
Right. The WTO, I know it's all about regulating global trade, but I'm curious about its origins. Did it just appear out of thin air?
Not quite. The WTO actually emerged from the ashes of a failed attempt to create a truly global trade body after World War II,
Ah.
the International Trade Organization, or ITO.
Wait, failed attempt. Tell me more. I'm sure this is relevant for us UPSC folks.
Well, the ITO was meant to be this grand institution covering not just trade,
Right.
but also investment, employment, and commodity agreements.
Oh,
But it ultimately failed to get off the ground.
why did it fail? Was it just too ambitious for its time?
It was certainly ambitious, but the real reason for its demise was domestic politics. Our sources explain that President Truman never even submitted the ITO's founding treaty to the U.S. Senate for approval, fearing it wouldn't pass.
Oh, wow.
This is a perfect example of how domestic political considerations can derail even the most well-intentioned international initiatives.
Yeah.
A point worth remembering for your UPSC preparations.
It definitely highlights the complex interplay between national interests and the development of global institutions. So if the ITO failed, how did we end up with the WTO?
That's where GATT comes in, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. It was created as a sort of placeholder while the ITO was being debated.
Okay.
GATT primarily focused on reducing tariffs on manufactured goods based on the most favored nation principle, meaning no country could be given preferential treatment over another in trade deals.
That sounds straightforward enough.
Yeah,
But I'm guessing there were some limitations to the GATT's approach, right?
you're right. GATT had several shortcomings. First, it largely excluded agriculture and services, two increasingly important sectors of the global economy.
Yeah.
Second, it struggled to deal with what are known as non-tariff barriers.
Non-tariff barriers. Could you explain what those are?
They're kind of sneaky ways to protect domestic industries without resorting to outright tariffs.
Okay.
Imagine a country imposing strict safety regulations on imported goods, even though these regulations are not applied to domestically produced goods.
Right.
Or think about quotas limiting the number of foreign cars that can be imported. These are examples of non-tariff barriers, and they can be very difficult to address within a traditional trade framework.
I see. They create hidden obstacles to free trade. So despite these limitations, GATT did achieve some success, right?
Oh, absolutely. Through multiple rounds of negotiations, GATT managed to significantly reduce tariffs on manufactured goods.
Oh, yeah.
The average tariff on manufactured goods went from about 40% in 1947 down to just 3% by 2000. That's a pretty remarkable accomplishment.
That is impressive. So what led to the creation of the WTO if GATT was achieving these successes?
Well, as the global economy evolved, GATT's limitations became more apparent. The Uruguay round of negotiations, which spanned from 1986 to 1994, was particularly challenging as countries grappled with issues like agriculture services and intellectual property rights. Ultimately, it became clear that a new, more robust institution was needed to govern global trade in the 21st century.
And that's where the WTO finally enters the stage. So what were the key differences between the WTO and its predecessor, GATT? I'm sure our UPSC listeners are eager to know.
The WTO marked a significant expansion in scope. It incorporated agreements on services, that's GATT's, the General Agreement on Trade in Services and Intellectual Property Rights, TRIPS, the Agreement on Trade-Related Aspects of Intellectual Property Rights, along with the updated GATT Agreement covering trade in goods. It also established a stronger enforcement mechanism through its dispute settlement body, which has the authority to issue rulings that are binding on member countries.
So the WTO is designed to be a more powerful and comprehensive institution. But did this new structure address the power imbalances that often exist between developed and developing countries in the global trading system?
That's the million-dollar question, and one that lies at the heart of much of the debate surrounding the WTO. While the organization operates on a one-country, one-vote principle in theory,
In reality, things are a bit more complicated, I imagine.
you got it. Despite the one-country, one-vote system, there are inherent power imbalances that can disadvantage developing countries within the WTO. They often lack the resources and expertise to fully participate in complex negotiations, which can put them at a disadvantage.
So even though the system appears equitable on paper, the reality is more nuanced.
Exactly. Developed countries often have more leverage due to their economic clout and their ability to influence the agenda and shape the outcomes of trade negotiations. This is a key criticism leveled against the WTO, with some arguing that it's essentially a rich man's club.
That's a pretty harsh critique.
Yeah.
What are some specific examples of how this power imbalance plays out within the WTO?
One example is the inclusion of agriculture under the WTO's purview. While it was a positive step to bring agriculture into the trade regime, the agreement on agriculture has been criticized for allowing developed countries to continue protecting their agricultural sectors through subsidies and other measures which can disadvantage farmers in developing countries.
So it seems like there's this constant tension between the ideal of free trade, which theoretically benefits everyone, and the reality of power imbalances and competing national interests. How does the WTO grapple with this tension?
That's a great question, and it's something that's been playing out in real time within the WTO. Our sources point to the Doha round of negotiations, which began in 2001 but stalled in 2009.
The Doha round. What happened there?
The Doha round was meant to address some of the imbalances in the global trading system, particularly with regard to agriculture and development issues. But it became bogged down in disagreements between developed and developing countries, particularly over agricultural subsidies and market access.
It sounds like a classic case of clashing interests and difficulties in reaching a consensus.
Exactly. The Doha round's failure to reach a conclusion highlights the challenges of bridging the gap between free trade and fair trade, a dilemma that the WTO continues to grapple with. And to complicate matters further, the rise of China and other emerging economies is adding another layer of complexity to the WTO's landscape. These countries are no longer content to play by the rules set by developed nations.
Right. The global balance of power is shifting, and the WTO will need to adapt if it wants to remain a relevant and effective institution in the 21st century. It's like we're witnessing a tectonic shift in the global economic order.
A very apt analogy. This shift raises a lot of questions about the future of global trade governance. Will the WTO be able to accommodate the interests of these rising powers? Will we see a more equitable and inclusive trading system emerge? Or will the system fracture under the strain of competing interests?
Fascinating questions, and ones that our UPSC aspirants should definitely be pondering. This interplay between established powers and rising economies is a key theme in international relations today. So going back to the core debate surrounding these institutions, is there any way to reconcile the competing perspectives on free trade versus fair trade?
That's the crux of the matter, isn't it? Proponents of free trade argue that it allows countries to specialize in what they're best at producing, leading to greater efficiency and overall economic growth. They point to the success stories of countries like South Korea and Taiwan, which embraced export-oriented strategies and achieved remarkable economic transformations.
The rising tide lifts all boats argument. But as we discussed, the reality is often more complicated. Critics point out that this approach doesn't always work in practice, especially for developing countries that often lack the infrastructure, resources, and technological capabilities to compete effectively in the global marketplace.
Precisely. And even if they do manage to produce goods for export, they often get stuck at the bottom of the value chain, exporting raw materials and importing expensive finished products. This can lead to persistent trade deficits and a drain on their economies. It's a trap that many developing countries have struggled to escape.
And it's not just about economic outcomes, right? Critics also raise concerns about the social and environmental impacts of unfettered globalization.
Absolutely. The pursuit of lower costs can lead to a race to the bottom, with companies cutting corners on worker safety, environmental protection, and even human rights. Think sweatshops, deforestation, and the exploitation of vulnerable populations. These are the hidden costs of globalization that are often overlooked in purely economic calculations.
So how do we address these concerns?
Yes, sir.
Is there a way to have a system of global trade that is both free and fair, one that promotes economic growth while also upholding social and environmental standards?
That's the challenge, and there's no easy answer. Some argue that we need to reform existing institutions like the WTO, making them more democratic, transparent, and accountable.
What would those reforms look like?
Well, for starters, giving developing countries more voting power within the WTO would be a good first step. They need a stronger voice at the negotiating table. And providing them with technical assistance and capacity building support would help them participate more effectively in complex trade talks. We also need to tackle those non-tariff barriers that often disproportionately disadvantage developing countries.
That makes sense. But some argue that these reforms don't go far enough. They say we need to rethink the very foundations of the global trade system, moving away from a purely market-driven approach towards a model that places greater emphasis on social and environmental considerations.
That's right. Some advocate for incorporating labor and environmental standards into trade agreements, ensuring that workers are protected and that environmental regulations are respected. Others promote fair trade practices that guarantee farmers and producers in developing countries receive a fair price for their products. There's also a growing movement towards supporting sustainable development initiatives that help developing countries diversify their economies and build resilience.
So it's a complex and evolving debate. But ultimately, the future of global trade will depend on finding ways to balance economic efficiency with social justice and environmental sustainability.
Couldn't agree more. And these are exactly the kinds of questions that our UPSC aspirants should be grappling with. The UPSC exam isn't just about memorizing facts and figures, it's about demonstrating critical thinking and the ability to analyze complex issues from multiple perspectives.
Right, it's about understanding the nuances, the trade-offs, and the potential solutions to the challenges facing our world.
And remember, this knowledge is not just relevant for exams, it's essential for anyone who wants to be an informed and engaged citizen in a globalized world. These institutions and the decisions they make impact our lives in countless ways, whether we realize it or not.
It's about empowering yourself to understand the forces shaping the global economy and to participate in the debate about how to create a more just and sustainable future. So coming back to the institutions we've been dissecting today, are the World Bank and the WTO forces for good? Or are they just tools of powerful nations? After all this discussion, where do you stand?
It's not a black and white issue. These institutions are products of their time, reflecting the power dynamics and ideological currents of the post-World War II era. They have both successes and failures, and they've been subject to constant critique and calls for reform.
It's like they're giant ships navigating a constantly changing ocean. The currents are shifting, the winds are unpredictable, and there are always new challenges on the horizon.
And another great analogy, and the crew on these ships, the people who work within these institutions, are constantly trying to adjust course to adapt to the changing environment and to steer towards a more equitable and sustainable future.
But the big question remains, who's really at the helm? Are these institutions sailing toward a destination that benefits all countries, or are they primarily serving the interests of the most powerful nations?
That's a question for you, the listener, to ponder. We've given you the historical context, the key facts, and the different perspectives on these complex institutions. Now it's up to you to weigh the evidence, form your own conclusions, and maybe even get involved in shaping the future of global economic governance.
Because at the end of the day, these aren't just abstract concepts or distant institutions. They have a real impact on people's lives all over the world, from farmers in developing countries to consumers in industrialized nations.
And understanding how these institutions work and how they can be reformed or reimagined is crucial for anyone who wants to contribute to creating a more just and sustainable world.
It's about recognizing that we're all interconnected, and the choices we make both individually and collectively have ripple effects across the globe.
Precisely. And that brings us to another crucial point, especially for our UPSC aspirants. Understanding the theoretical frameworks that help us make sense of these complex dynamics.
Right. Theories like dependency theory and world systems theory, which are often covered in the UPSC syllabus, provide valuable insights into the power imbalances and inequalities that shape the global political economy.
Dependency theory, for example, argues that the global economic system is structured in a way that benefits developed countries at the expense of developing countries, perpetuating a cycle of underdevelopment and dependency. World systems theory expands on this idea, viewing the world as a hierarchical system divided into core, periphery, and semi-periphery regions, with the core exploiting the periphery for its resources and cheap labor.
These theories offer powerful lenses through which to analyze the role of institutions like the World Bank and the WTO and their impact on developing countries.
Exactly. And by understanding these theoretical frameworks, UPSC aspirants can develop more nuanced and sophisticated arguments in their essays and debates.
So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. The history of the World Bank and the WTO, their roles in the global economy, the controversy surrounding them, the ongoing debate about free trade versus fair trade, and the theoretical frameworks that help us make sense of it all. It's a lot to digest.
It is. But hopefully this deep dive has sparked your curiosity and given you a solid foundation for further exploration.
And remember, knowledge is power. The more you understand about these institutions, the better equipped you'll be to navigate the complexities of the global financial landscape and to advocate for a world that works for everyone.
Exactly. And for our UPSC aspirants, this knowledge is essential for success in the exam. Understanding these institutions, the debates surrounding them, and the theoretical frameworks that underpin them will help you craft insightful and well-argued essays and responses.
All right, folks, we're going to take a quick breather here to gather our thoughts and prepare for the grand finale of this deep dive. When we come back, we'll leave you with some final thought-provoking questions to ponder as you continue your exploration of the World Bank, the WTO, and the ever-evolving world of international relations.
And in the meantime, if you're finding this deep dive helpful, we encourage you to like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on future episodes.
We'll see you right back here in a few moments.
Free.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the World Bank and the WTO. We covered a lot, but I think it's important to step back and ask, where do we go from here? What's the future of these institutions?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? We've talked about the need for reform, more transparency, a more level playing field, but how do we actually make those changes happen?
Especially in a world facing so many complex challenges, climate change, inequality, political instability. Are these institutions equipped to deal with these global issues, or do we need entirely new mechanisms for global cooperation?
It's a crucial question, and one that doesn't have a simple answer. For you UPSC aspirants, thinking critically about these issues is key. Can you analyze the effectiveness of these institutions in addressing global challenges? Can you evaluate their impact on developing countries and propose potential reforms or alternative approaches?
Those are great points to consider. Remember, the UPSC isn't just about regurgitating facts. It's about demonstrating your understanding of the complexities and being able to articulate well-informed arguments.
Absolutely. And for anyone listening, whether you're preparing for the UPSC or simply interested in understanding the world around you, I want to leave you with some thought-provoking questions to ponder.
I love a good brain teaser. Hit us with those questions.
Okay, first, in an increasingly interconnected world where challenges like climate change and economic inequality transcend national borders, what role should institutions like the World Bank and WTO play? Are they part of the solution, or are they part of the problem?
That's a big one. And it leads to another question. How do we balance the pursuit of economic growth with the need for social justice and environmental sustainability? Can free trade truly be fair trade? Or do we need to fundamentally rethink the rules of the game?
Right, and we've discussed the critiques of these institutions and how they often perpetuate existing power structures. So this leads to another essential question. What can you as an individual do to influence these institutions and help shape the future of the global economy?
These are big questions, and they don't have easy answers. But the first step is to engage with them. Learn as much as you can critically evaluate the information you encounter, and don't be afraid to voice your opinions and ideas.
Exactly. Remember, the world is not static. It's constantly evolving, and so are these institutions. Your understanding of these dynamics, coupled with your critical thinking and engagement, can help shape a better future.
So keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for positive change. And remember, this deep dive has only scratched the surface of these complex institutions. There's a whole ocean of knowledge out there waiting to be explored.
And if you found this deep dive helpful, we encourage you to like and subscribe to our channel for more explorations into the fascinating world of international relations.
Until next time, keep diving deep.